Every person who has ever lived has faced something they didn't choose. The question isn't whether difficulty comes. It already did. It's here now, or it's waiting around the next corner. The question is, what happens inside you when it arrives? Two people lose their jobs on the same day. One discovers strengths they never knew they had. The other spirals into bitterness that poisons everything they touch. Same loss, radically different outcomes. Buddhist practitioners have studied this pattern for 25 centuries. Not as theory, but through their own lives. Exile, persecution, poverty, illness, violent opposition. What they discovered was specific, a way of meeting hardship that transforms it. Tonight, you'll hear 10 of their stories. A monk who kept saving a scorpion that kept stinging him. A serial killer who became a great teacher. A grandmother working with devastating grief. A yogi who built strength through years of deprivation. A poor woman whose smallest gift changed everything. A barber who proved society's limits were lies. Alongside these ancient teachings, you'll see how the same principles work when ordinary people face impossible situations today. Not philosophy, actual methods. Whether you're facing something difficult right now, or simply want to understand how transformation actually works, these next 3 hours will show you. Find a comfortable spot. Leave a comment about where you're listening, if you'd like. Let's begin. Our first story takes place by a river, where a monk is walking along the bank at sunset. The water flows quietly, catching the last gold light of day. The monk notices something struggling in the shallows. A scorpion, swept from the rocks, drowning in water too deep for its small legs to find purchase. Without hesitation, the monk bends down and scoops the scorpion into his palm to lift it to safety. The scorpion, doing what scorpions do, immediately stings him. The monk's hand jerks from the pain, and the scorpion falls back into the water. Again, the monk reaches down. Again, he lifts the scorpion toward the safety of the shore. Again, the scorpion stings him. This happens a third time, a fourth. A farmer has stopped on the path to watch this strange scene. Finally, he calls out in frustration, "Why do you keep trying to save that creature? Can't you see it keeps stinging you? Just let it drown." The monk looks up at the farmer, his hand swelling now, still reaching for the scorpion. "Brother," he says, "it is the scorpion's nature to sting. Should I abandon my nature to save simply because the scorpion does not abandon its nature to harm?" On the fifth attempt, the monk finally places the scorpion on dry ground. It scuttles away into the rocks, unaware it was ever saved. The monk wraps his wounded hand and continues his walk along the river. This story, passed down through generations of Buddhist practitioners, asks something radical of us. It asks whether our values can remain steady when others harm us, whether our compassion can survive other people's cruelty, whether we can maintain who we are when the world seems determined to make us into something harder, colder, more protected. Buddhism teaches that every being has patterns of behavior shaped by countless causes and conditions. The scorpion's nature drives it to sting when threatened. This isn't evil. It's just what a scorpion is. The monk's nature, developed through years of practice, is to relieve suffering wherever he encounters it. Not only when it's convenient, not only when the suffering belongs to someone who deserves help, not only when helping is safe. This teaching on unwavering compassion sits at the heart of Buddhist practice. The Pali word is karuna, though you don't need the word to understand the practice. It means compassion that doesn't waver based on whether someone deserves it. Compassion that flows like water, finding its way to low places, regardless of what caused those low places to exist. The farmer's question represents how most of us think. If someone keeps hurting us, shouldn't we stop helping them? If people are hostile, shouldn't we become hostile back? If the world is cruel, shouldn't we armor ourselves? The monk's answer reveals a different logic entirely. When you let someone else's actions determine your actions, you've given them control over who you are. The scorpion stings, so now you stop saving living things. One person is cruel, so now you become cruel too. Someone abandons their values, so you abandon yours. This isn't about being a doormat. The monk could have used a stick to lift the scorpion. He could have wrapped his hand. He could have asked the farmer for help. Compassion doesn't require foolishness. But he wouldn't stop trying to save a life simply because that life couldn't recognize it was being saved. Here's what Buddhism actually teaches about our capacity to respond. The untrained mind reacts automatically to whatever happens. Someone insults you, anger flares. Someone threatens you, fear rises. Someone harms you, you want to harm them back. These reactions aren't chosen. They arise from conditioning, from old patterns, from survival instincts that served our ancestors but often harm us now. But through practice, something shifts. A small gap appears between what happens and how you respond. In that gap, choice becomes possible. Not because you now have complete control over your mind, not because you've transcended being human, but because mindfulness creates space where awareness can see what's arising before it takes over completely. The monk by the river had developed this capacity through years of meditation, ethical training, and conscious practice. When the scorpion stung him, his body still jerked, pain still registered, but between the sting and his next action, there was space. Space where he could remember his training. Space where he could choose to reach for the scorpion again. This is what Buddhist practice actually offers. Not magical control over your reactions, but the gradual development of the capacity to respond rather than simply react. This matters profoundly when life is hard. During the pandemic's worst months, nurses and doctors walked into rooms where patients were dying of a virus those same patients insisted didn't exist. Some of these patients cursed medical workers as part of a conspiracy. Some yanked off oxygen masks. Some refused treatment, while simultaneously demanding to be saved. The healthcare workers who maintained their compassion through this didn't do it because those patients earned it. They did it because they had trained themselves, through repeated practice, to respond from their values, rather than react from anger or fear. The scorpion was still stinging. They kept reaching into the water. A special education teacher in Oregon works with a 7-year-old who hits her almost daily. The child has severe autism and expresses fear through violence. Every morning for 3 years, this teacher has greeted him with the same gentle voice, the same patient presence, the same genuine care. "Good morning, James. I'm glad you're here." Does she never feel frustrated? Of course she does. Does her body never tense when he raises his hand? Of course it does. But she's developed the capacity to feel those reactions and still choose her response. Last month, for the first time, James said good morning back. Customer service workers face an endless stream of people having their worst days. Delayed flights, lost packages, billing errors, broken products. Some customers scream, some insult, some treat service workers like they're not quite human. The workers who can stay kind through this aren't superhuman. They've simply learned that the first reaction, defensiveness, anger, the urge to strike back, doesn't have to become their action. They've developed the capacity to pause. One woman who works at an airport described it this way. A man was screaming at her because his flight was cancelled by weather. She could feel her own anger rising, her throat tightening, words forming that would cut him down. Then she remembered something her grandmother told her before she died. "Baby, hurt people. Don't let their hurt make you hurt too." She took a breath. She looked at this man who was red-faced and shaking, and she saw someone terrified he'd miss something important, someone who felt completely powerless, someone striking out because that was the only power he could grasp. "Sir," she said quietly, "I can see you're really upset. Let me see what I can do to help." He stopped mid-sentence. His shoulders dropped. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm trying to get to my daughter's wedding." Adult children caring for parents with dementia face perhaps the hardest version of this teaching. Your mother no longer knows your name. Your father, who was gentle his whole life, now becomes combative, frightened, sometimes cruel. They need help with everything, and sometimes they fight that help with the fury of a trapped animal. The caregivers who survive this with their hearts intact aren't just enduring. They're practicing something the monk by the river understood. Their parents' illness made them forget who they're looking at. But illness won't make the caregiver forget who they're caring for. Buddhist teachers have understood this for centuries. When you harden your heart to protect yourself, you don't just shut out the pain, you shut out everything. Joy becomes muted. Connection becomes harder. You become less alive in trying to hurt less. But when you maintain your values, even as others abandon theirs, something different happens. You discover you're stronger than you thought. Each time you stay kind when someone is cruel, you prove to yourself that your kindness isn't dependent on their kindness. Each time you help someone who can't or won't appreciate it, you prove that your values aren't transactional. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught about loving kindness as an unshakable foundation. The word for this in Buddhist teaching is metta, though again, the word matters less than the practice. It's a quality of friendliness and goodwill that you carry regardless of circumstances, not because everyone deserves it, but because this is who you've chosen to become through training. Think of it like this. The sun doesn't check who's standing in its light before it shines. It doesn't withhold warmth from people who've done terrible things. It doesn't shine brighter on those who appreciate it. It simply shines because that's what the sun does. Through practice, your compassion can work the same way. This doesn't mean you let people harm you repeatedly without boundaries. The monk could have walked away from the river entirely. You can remove yourself from harmful situations while maintaining compassion for the person causing harm. You can protect yourself and still not become cruel. The practice is about developing the capacity to respond from your values rather than react from your conditioning. So how do you actually build this capacity? How do you develop the gap between stimulus and response? Start by noticing what happens in your body when someone harms you. Feel the urge to strike back, to defend, to hurt them as they've hurt you. Just notice it. You don't have to act on it. This noticing is the beginning of training. You're creating a tiny space of awareness between the reaction arising and the action that might follow. Then ask yourself a simple question. Who do I want to be right now? Not who does this person deserve to encounter? Not who would this situation justify me becoming? But who do I want to be? If the answer is someone kind, be kind. If the answer is someone who helps, help. If the answer is someone who doesn't let others' cruelty turn them cruel, then don't. It won't always work perfectly. You'll get stung sometimes, and you'll drop the scorpion, and you'll want to walk away from the river entirely. That's fine. This is practice, not perfection. Buddhism teaches gradual training, not instant transformation. Each time you notice your reaction before you act on it, you strengthen that capacity. Each time you pause between stimulus and response, that gap grows slightly wider. Each time you choose your values over your conditioning, you become a little bit freer. The Buddha taught this 25 centuries ago. Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is an ancient and eternal law. He wasn't being idealistic. He was being practical. When you meet cruelty with cruelty, you create more suffering in the world, and you create more suffering in yourself. When you meet cruelty with compassion, at least the suffering stops with you. Tonight, as you rest, consider this. When someone stings you, and someone will, can you remember what the monk remembered by the river? That their nature to harm doesn't have to override your capacity to help. That who you're becoming through practice matters more than what they did. That you can develop, through training, the ability to be the monk rather than become the scorpion. The Buddha said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." Part of loving yourself is refusing to become someone you wouldn't recognize. Part of loving yourself is training yourself to respond from your values, even when others abandon theirs. Part of loving yourself is being the monk who reaches into the water again. Not because the scorpion will stop stinging, but because, through practice, you've developed the capacity to save lives, regardless of whether those lives can appreciate being saved. This is the first teaching. Your compassion can become stronger than their cruelty, not through force, but through training, not overnight, but gradually, one moment of awareness at a time. There was once a man who wore a necklace made of human fingers. His name was Angulimala, which means garland of fingers, and he had killed 999 people to make that necklace. One finger from each victim, strung together and worn around his neck as he hunted through the forests outside the city of Savatthi. He had been a brilliant student once, a young Brahmin studying under a renowned teacher. But his teacher, jealous of the student's intelligence, decided to destroy him. He told Angulimala that to complete his spiritual training, he must offer a sacrifice of 1,000 human fingers. The young man, believing his teacher completely, set out to collect them. And with each killing, something inside him died until only the killer remained. The roads around Savatthi became deserted. Whole villages emptied. Travelers took routes that added days to their journeys rather than pass through that forest. The king's soldiers tried to capture him and failed. Parents told their children stories about Angulimala to keep them from wandering. He needed one more finger to reach 1,000. His mother heard that her son had become a murderer. Despite everything, despite the monster he'd become, she loved him still. She set out to find him, to try one last time to bring him back to his senses. Angulimala saw her coming down the forest path. He raised his sword. One more finger, and his offering would be complete. The Buddha was staying in a monastery nearby. When he understood what was about to happen, he simply started walking toward the forest. His monks tried to stop him. Blessed One, that's where Angulimala hunts. Even the king's army fears him. The Buddha kept walking. Angulimala saw a monk in saffron robes coming down the path. He forgot about his mother and turned toward this new victim. He began to run, his sword ready, his necklace of bones rattling against his chest. But something impossible happened. The Buddha was walking at a normal pace, calm and unhurried. Angulimala was running with all his strength, yet no matter how fast he ran, he could not catch up. The distance between them never changed. Finally, exhausted and confused, Angulimala shouted, "Stop, monk." The Buddha turned and looked at him with eyes that held no fear. "I have stopped," the Buddha said. "It is you who have not stopped." Something in those words reached through all the killing, through all the blood, through all the years of madness. Angulimala dropped his sword. He fell to his knees, and for the first time since he'd started killing, he wept. "Can someone like me be saved?" he asked. "Come," the Buddha said. "Come and live the holy life." Right there, in the forest where he'd murdered hundreds, Angulimala became a monk. But becoming a monk didn't erase what he'd done. When Angulimala walked through the streets with his alms bowl, people recognized him. They threw stones. They hit him with sticks. They spat on him and cursed him. He would return to the monastery bleeding, his robes torn, his bowl empty. The Buddha looked at his wounds and said something that sounds harsh until you understand it. Endure it. You are experiencing in this life what would have caused you to suffer in hell for many years. Bear it patiently. Angulimala bore it, and in bearing it, he found peace. This story makes most people uncomfortable. We want to believe that some people are beyond saving. We want to believe that certain actions put you outside the circle of those who deserve compassion. We want clear lines between the redeemable and the irredeemable, between people who deserve another chance and people who don't. Buddhism refuses to draw that line. The Buddha's teaching is radical in its refusal to give up on anyone. No matter how far someone has fallen, no matter what they've done, transformation remains possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. This doesn't mean actions don't have consequences. Angulimala still faced the results of what he'd done. The families he destroyed didn't suddenly forgive him. The communities he terrorized didn't welcome him back. The stones people threw were real, and they hurt. Buddhism teaches that actions create results. This isn't punishment handed down by a judging God. It's more like natural law. You plant apple seeds, you get apple trees. You create suffering, suffering returns to you. The Buddha called this the principle of action and result. What you do shapes what happens to you, shapes who you become, shapes the world you live in, not because the universe is keeping score, but because actions have momentum. They ripple outward. They change things. Angulimala couldn't undo the killings. The 999 people were still dead. Their families were still grieving. The fear he'd created still lived in the memories of everyone who'd survived his terror. But he could stop creating more suffering. He could face what he'd done without adding denial or self-destruction to the pile of harm. He could accept the consequences without becoming bitter or defensive. This acceptance is what made his transformation real. Most people who've done terrible things respond in one of two ways. They either deny it completely, building walls of justification and blame, or they collapse into such complete self-hatred that they can't function, can't change, can't do anything except drown in guilt. Angulimala did neither. He acknowledged what he'd done. He accepted the consequences. And he used what remained of his life to become someone different. When people threw stones at him, he didn't throw them back. When they cursed him, he didn't curse them. He understood that their anger was justified, their fear was real, their hatred was earned. He bore it patiently, as the Buddha had taught him. And slowly, over time, some people began to see that he had changed. During the pandemic, healthcare workers faced impossible situations. Doctors and nurses had to decide who got ventilators when there weren't enough. They watched people die alone because families couldn't visit. They worked until they collapsed, knowing some patients would die regardless. Many of these workers carried terrible guilt afterward. If I had just worked harder, stayed longer, tried something else. Some developed crushing depression. Some left medicine entirely. They couldn't forgive themselves for the deaths they couldn't prevent. The ones who found peace did something similar to what Angulimala did. They acknowledged that some patients died. They accepted that they'd done their best in impossible circumstances. They carried the weight of what happened without letting it destroy them. One nurse described it this way: "I can't undo the deaths. I can't go back and save the ones we lost, but I can show up tomorrow for the patients who are still here. I can use what I learned from those terrible months to be better now." In San Quentin prison, there's a Buddhist meditation program. Men serving life sentences sit together in silence, watching their minds, working with their guilt and rage and grief. Some of these men have done things as terrible as what Angulimala did. One man had killed during a robbery. He'd served 30 years. He could recite every detail of what happened that night. The fear in his victim's eyes, the sound of the shot, the moment he realized what he'd done. "I can't bring him back," he said. "I can't give his family their father and husband back. I can't undo 30 years of their grief, but I can make sure that the person I am now would never do what that person did then. That's all I have. He still faces the consequences. He's still in prison. He'll likely die there. But he's found a kind of peace by accepting this without bitterness, without self-destruction, without giving up on the possibility of being someone different. Former gang members face something similar. One man left gang life after his best friend was killed in retaliation for something they'd done together. He got clean, got a job, started trying to help kids avoid the path he'd taken. But his community didn't trust him. Parents didn't want him near their children. Police still watched him. People who'd lost loved ones to gang violence saw him on the street, and their faces went hard. He could have become bitter. He could have said, "I'm trying to change, and no one will let me." Instead, he kept showing up, kept proving through actions, not words, that he was different, kept accepting that people's distrust was earned. 5 years later, some of those same parents asked him to talk to their teenagers who were being recruited by gangs. They'd watched him long enough to believe the change was real. In recovery communities, people work through this daily. Someone sober for 5 years still lives with the damage they caused while using. The divorce that can't be undone, the children who don't trust them yet, the job they lost, the health problems that won't go away. They show up to meetings and they say, "I'm responsible for this. I did this, and I'm doing everything I can to be different now." They don't demand forgiveness. They don't expect trust. They accept that some consequences will follow them forever, but they refuse to let those consequences be an excuse to stop trying. This is the path Angulimala walked. So how do you actually practice this when you're carrying something terrible? When you've done something you can't undo, hurt someone you can't unhurt, created damage that can't be repaired. First, you stop running from what you did. You look at it clearly, without justification or minimizing, not to torture yourself, but to see accurately what happened. Second, you accept that consequences are natural, not punishment. People don't trust you. That makes sense. Opportunities are closed. That follows from what you did. You feel guilty. That's appropriate. Third, you don't let guilt become your identity. You did terrible things. You are not defined by terrible things. You can become someone different, even while facing the results of who you were. Fourth, you make what amends you can and accept that some damage can't be repaired. You do what's possible without demanding that it erase what happened. Fifth, you live the rest of your life differently. Not to earn redemption. You can't earn your way out of what you did. But because transformation itself is the only response that makes sense. The Buddha taught that no one is beyond change. Not the worst killer. Not the cruelest person. Not you. No matter what you've done. This doesn't minimize harm. It doesn't excuse actions. It doesn't mean consequences disappear. It means that who you were doesn't have to determine who you become. It means that transformation is possible even from the darkest places. It means that bearing consequences patiently, without bitterness, can itself become a path to peace. Tonight, if you're carrying something heavy from your past, remember this. Angulimala wore a necklace of 999 finger bones. People threw stones at him until he bled, and still he found peace. Not by escaping consequences, not by denying what he'd done, not by drowning in guilt, but by accepting what couldn't be changed and becoming someone different anyway. The Buddha said, "However many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do you if you do not act upon them?" Transformation isn't about words. It's about becoming, through action and acceptance, someone your past self wouldn't recognize. Someone who faces consequences without collapsing. Someone who changes without demanding applause for changing. If Angulimala could walk that path, so can you. Not because what you did doesn't matter, but because what you do next matters more. There was a merchant named Bahia who lived in a prosperous coastal city. He had wealth, respect, a thriving business, and all the comforts that success could provide. One day, he set sail on a trading voyage across the ocean. The journey began smoothly, the ship loaded with valuable goods, the crew experienced, the weather favorable. Then the storm hit. It came suddenly, violently, the kind of storm that strips away any illusion that humans control their fate. The ship broke apart in the massive waves. Bahia watched his cargo disappear into the dark water. He watched his crew drown. He clung to a piece of broken wood and drifted for days, more dead than alive. When he finally washed ashore, he had nothing. No clothes, no money, no identity as a successful merchant. Just a body barely alive and a mind shattered by loss. He wrapped himself in bark cloth he found in the forest. He begged for food in the villages. People looked at him with pity or disgust. This wild-looking man who'd lost everything. But something strange happened in that complete devastation. With nothing left to protect, nothing left to build, nothing left to become, Bahia's mind became unusually clear. The constant mental noise that had filled his life as a merchant, planning, worrying, calculating, protecting, all of it had been washed away with everything else. He heard that the Buddha was teaching nearby. Something in him knew he needed to find this teacher immediately. Not tomorrow, not after he'd rebuilt his life, but right now, exactly as he was, barefoot, wearing bark cloth, with nothing. Bahia walked into the city of Savatthi and found the Buddha walking on arms round with his monks. He approached directly, desperately. "Venerable Sir, please teach me the Dharma. Please teach me so I can know freedom from suffering." The Buddha kept walking. "This is not the time, Bahia. I am on arms round." But Bahia persisted. "Venerable Sir, life is uncertain. Death could come at any moment for either of us. Please teach me now." He asked 3 times, each time more urgently. Finally, the Buddha stopped and looked at this desperate man in bark cloth. And he gave Bahia one of the most direct, uncompromising teachings he ever offered. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, only the heard. In the sensed, only the sensed. In the cognized, only the cognized. When for you there is in the seen only the seen, in the heard only the heard, in the sensed only the sensed, in the cognized only the cognized, then you will not be identified with it. When you are not identified with it, you will not be located in it. When you are not located in it, there is no you in connection with this world, no you in connection with the world beyond, and no you in between. This, just this, is the end of suffering. Bahia heard these words and understood completely. Right there on the street, still wearing bark cloth, still with nothing, he awakened. Later that day, he was gored by a cow and died. The Buddha's disciples found his body and asked about him. The Buddha said that Bahia had been one of the quickest to understand the teaching he'd ever encountered. This story makes most people uncomfortable. We want to believe that spiritual awakening requires years of preparation, proper circumstances, the right conditions. We want time to get ready, to become worthy, to fix ourselves first. But Bahia's story teaches something different. Sometimes the moment when you have nothing left is exactly when you're most ready to understand everything. When the storm stripped away Bahia's wealth, his identity, his plans, his security, it also stripped away the barriers between him and direct understanding. He wasn't waiting to become enlightened after he rebuilt his business. He wasn't postponing awakening until he had proper clothes and a respectable appearance. He understood that this moment, exactly as it was the only moment available. The Buddha's teaching to him was radically simple. Stop adding stories to your direct experience. Stop turning what you see into who you are. Just see, just hear, just sense, just know, without making it all about you. When you're not turning everything into self, there's no self to suffer. It's not that you disappear. It's that you stop being imprisoned by the constant need to defend and maintain an identity. Bahia could understand this because losing everything had already shown him that the self he'd been protecting didn't exist the way he thought it did. His identity as a successful merchant had been completely dependent on conditions that a single storm could erase. So when the Buddha pointed to direct experience without self-construction, Bahia recognized the truth immediately. This teaching matters for anyone facing complete devastation. A woman loses her career of 20 years when her company goes bankrupt overnight. Not downsizing, not restructuring, complete collapse. She'd built her entire identity around being successful in this field. Her friends were colleagues. Her social status came from her title. Her sense of worth was tied to her professional achievements. After the initial shock and grief, something unexpected happens. Without the constant pressure to maintain that identity, she notices how much energy she'd been spending on performance, on looking successful, on meeting others' expectations. She starts painting again. Something she loved before her career consumed her life. She discovers she can be happy in ways that have nothing to do with professional achievement. A man's house burns down in a wildfire. Everything, photos, heirlooms, possessions, accumulated over decades. He stands in the ashes and realizes he's lighter than he's been in years. Not that he wanted this, not that the loss doesn't hurt, but suddenly he's not carrying the weight of maintaining all those things, protecting all those possessions, organizing all that stuff. A marriage ends after 15 years. The woman who defined herself as wife and partner suddenly has no idea who she is alone. She spends months in grief and confusion. Then slowly, she starts discovering preferences she'd forgotten she had, interests that got buried in compromise, a version of herself that exists independent of being half of a couple. An athlete suffers an injury that ends his career. His whole life has been training, competing, being known as exceptional in his sport. When that's taken away, he goes through despair and rage. But eventually, he discovers that he's more than what his body could do, that his worth isn't determined by performance, that he can find meaning in teaching or mentoring or simply being human without being exceptional. These aren't stories about silver linings or everything happening for a reason. They're about what becomes possible when circumstances force you to stop clinging to an identity that was always more fragile than you thought. Bahaya's awakening wasn't despite losing everything. It was because losing everything cleared away the obstructions. So when life strips you down to nothing, you have a choice. You can spend all your energy trying to rebuild exactly what you had. Or you can recognize that this moment of having nothing might be the clearest moment you've ever had. This doesn't mean you don't take practical action to rebuild your life. Bahia still needed to eat, still needed clothing, but he didn't wait until everything was perfect before seeking understanding. He went directly to what mattered most, exactly as he was. Notice what you're waiting for before you can be at peace. Notice what you think needs to be in place before you can be free. Notice how you're postponing your own awakening until conditions are right. Bahia's teaching is that the conditions are never going to be perfect. Life is uncertain. Death could come at any moment. The only moment you actually have is this one, whatever state it's in. When everything is stripped away, what remains? Not the roles you played, not the possessions you accumulated, not the identity you maintained. What remains is the simple capacity to be aware, to experience, to be present. That awareness doesn't need anything to be valid. It doesn't need success or comfort or security. It's already here, already whole, already free. Tonight, if you've lost something that felt like everything, remember this. Bahia lost his ship, his cargo, his crew, his wealth, his clothes, his identity. He approached the Buddha, wearing bark cloth and begging for food. And in that state of having nothing, he understood everything. Not because loss makes you enlightened, but because sometimes losing what you thought you were clears the way to discovering what you actually are. The Buddha said this to Bahia: when you stop making everything about you, suffering ends. Just this moment, this experience, this breath, without turning it into a story about who you are or should be. If Bahia could find freedom in bark cloth with nothing left, you can find it too. Not after you rebuild. Not when conditions improve. Right now, exactly as things are. In a small monastery on the edge of a mountain village, there was a monk whose job was to grind grain for the community's meals. Every morning before dawn, he would take the large stone pestle and grind rice, barley, and wheat into flour. The pestle had been used for generations. It was heavy granite, worn smooth by decades of hands, and it fit perfectly into the grinding stone below. The monk had used it for years, knew its weight, knew how it moved, knew the rhythm of grinding that produced the finest flour. One morning, he lifted the pestle and saw a crack running through it. Not a small surface crack, but a deep fissure that went nearly halfway through the stone. His first response was frustration. This pestle had been perfect. Now it was flawed, compromised, potentially dangerous. If it broke completely while he was using it, he would need to request a new one from the village stonecutter, which would take weeks and cost money the monastery barely had. He brought the cracked pestle to the abbot. "Master, the grinding stone has cracked. I need a new one. I cannot work with this." The abbot examined the pestle carefully, running his fingers along the crack. "Can you still grind grain with it?" "Yes, but it's cracked," the monk said, as if this was obvious. "It's not what it should be." "Then use it," the abbot said simply, handing it back. The monk stared at him in disbelief. "But master, it might break completely. It's damaged. It's not the right tool anymore." "It's the tool you have," the abbot replied. "Use it until it no longer works. Then we'll discuss what comes next." The monk returned to his work, angry and resentful. He felt the abbot was being unreasonable, forcing him to work with inferior equipment when anyone could see the pestle was broken. But he had his assignment, so he began grinding. At first, he ground carefully, tentatively, afraid the pestle would shatter in his hands. He kept stopping to check if the crack had widened. Every grain he ground felt like a reminder that he was working with something imperfect, something damaged, something that shouldn't be trusted. Days passed. The crack didn't grow. The pestle kept working. Slowly, reluctantly, the monk began to adjust. He found that if he changed his grip slightly, the pressure didn't fall directly on the cracked section. If he ground in smaller batches, he didn't need to press as hard. If he worked more slowly and mindfully, he could feel when the pestle was under stress and ease back. Within 2 weeks, he was grinding as much flour as he ever had, maybe more. The pestle with the crack was teaching him to pay attention in ways the perfect pestle never had. One morning, the abbot came to watch him work. The monk was deep in the rhythm of grinding, his movements smooth and practiced, his attention fully present with each stroke. "Tell me," the abbot said, "are you still waiting for a new pestle?" The monk paused, surprised to realize he'd forgotten about it entirely. "No, master," he said slowly. "This one works." "Does it work as well as the old one?" The monk considered this carefully. "It works differently. I have to pay more attention. I have to adjust my technique. But yes, it works. Sometimes I think it works better because I'm more present with it." The abbot smiled. "This is the teaching. Life cracks things. Tools break. Bodies age. Plans fail. Circumstances change. You can spend your energy wishing for what's not cracked, or you can learn to work skillfully with what is." The monk bowed, understanding finally what the abbot had been trying to show him from the beginning. This story cuts to the heart of a crucial distinction in Buddhist practice. Acceptance is not the same as resignation. Resignation says, "The pestle is cracked, so I give up. I'll just do poor work because I have poor tools. Nothing I can do about it." Acceptance says, "The pestle is cracked. That's reality. Now, how do I work skillfully within this reality?" One abandons agency. The other finds agency within constraints. Most of us spend enormous energy fighting against what already is. We have the cracked pestle, but we're so busy being angry about the crack that we never learn how to grind grain with it. We're so focused on what should be different that we miss what's actually possible right now. Buddhism teaches radical acceptance of what is, combined with wise action within those circumstances. You don't pretend the crack isn't there. You don't tell yourself a story. about how the crack doesn't matter. You see it clearly, accept it as reality, and then figure out how to work with it. This requires discernment, the ability to distinguish between what you can change and what you cannot. The monk could not make the crack disappear. He could not will the pestle back to its original perfect state. Fighting that reality would have been useless suffering. But he could change his grip. He could adjust his technique. He could work in smaller batches. He could pay closer attention. All of that was within his power. The difference matters enormously when you're facing difficulty. A woman develops chronic pain after a car accident. The first year, she fights it constantly, spending all her energy trying to force her body back to how it was before. She pushes through pain until she collapses. She's furious with her body for betraying her. She refuses to modify her activities because modification feels like surrender. Then something shifts. She accepts that pain is now part of her reality. Not forever, necessarily, but for now. She stops fighting and starts adapting. She learns which movements aggravate pain and which don't. She finds exercises that help. She discovers she can do most of what matters to her, just differently than before. This isn't giving up. This is finding power within limitation. A teacher has a student who disrupts class constantly. Standard discipline doesn't work. Consequences don't work. The teacher can spend the year fighting this reality, making herself and the student miserable, or she can accept that this student needs a different approach. She learns that he responds better to movement breaks than to sitting still. That he can focus if he's given a fidget tool. That he thrives when given classroom responsibilities. She adapts her teaching without abandoning her standards, and both of them have a better year. An entrepreneur builds a business that depends on in-person interaction. Then circumstances make in-person work impossible for an extended period. She can rage against the circumstances, or she can accept them and innovate. She creates virtual offerings, finds new ways to connect with clients, discovers markets she never knew existed. A man loses his job at 55. The industry he knows is dying. He can spend his energy bitter about how things should be, or he can accept the changed landscape and find where his skills still matter. He takes his expertise into consulting, into teaching, into an adjacent field that values what he knows. A parent has a child who is not neurotypical. The first years are spent trying to force the child into typical development patterns, into fitting the mold, into being normal. Everyone is miserable. Then the parent accepts their actual child, not the child they imagined, and suddenly they can see their child's actual strengths, actual needs, actual gifts. They adapt their parenting, and their child starts thriving. A writer develops arthritis in her hands. Typing becomes painful. She can stop writing and grieve what's lost. Or she can learn voice-to-text software, dictation, new ways of working. Her process changes completely, and she discovers the change brings new creativity. None of these people resigned themselves to suffering. They all accepted reality and found agency within it. So how do you practice this when you're facing your own cracked pestle? First, acknowledge what's actually broken. Don't minimize it. Don't pretend it's fine when it's not. The crack is real. See it clearly. Second, stop fighting the fact that it's cracked. This happened. This is reality now. Fighting reality is suffering added to suffering. Third, ask what's actually still possible. Not what should be possible if things were different, but what's genuinely available right now, given exactly how things are. Fourth, experiment with different approaches. The monk had to try different grips, different techniques, different batch sizes. He had to discover what worked with this particular crack. You'll need to experiment too. Fifth, notice when you're confusing acceptance with resignation. Resignation is passive, hopeless, abdication of agency. Acceptance is clear seeing that leads to wise action. Finally, stay present with what you're learning. The monk discovered that working with the cracked pestle taught him things the perfect pestle never could. Your constraints might be teaching you something valuable too. Tonight, if you're facing something broken that won't go back to how it was, remember this. The monk wanted a perfect pestle. He got a cracked one. He could have refused to work, spent his energy angry, ground poor flour while wishing for better tools. Instead, he learned to work with what he had. Not by pretending it wasn't cracked, but by accepting the crack and finding skill within that reality. The Buddha taught that suffering comes not from pain itself, but from our relationship to pain. Not from difficulty, but from our resistance to difficulty. Not from having cracked tools, but from refusing to learn how to use them. The pestle will crack. Something in your life will break. The body will age. Circumstances will change. Plans will fail. That's not the problem. The problem is thinking you can't work, can't thrive, can't create anything beautiful with cracked tools. The solution is learning to grind grain anyway, with attention, with adaptation, with acceptance of what is. This is wise action within constraints. This is freedom that doesn't require perfect conditions. This is the crack in the pestle that teaches what the perfect pestle never could. After years of studying with his teacher Marpa, the Tibetan yogi Milarepa retreated to a cave high in the Himalayas. Not for a week or a month, but for years of solitary practice in conditions that would break most people within days. The cave was barely shelter. Wind howled through cracks in the rock. Snow piled at the entrance during winter, sometimes blocking him in completely. The stone floor was so cold that sitting on it felt like sitting on ice. Milarepa owned nothing. One thin cotton robe, so worn it was falling apart. No blankets, no fire, no supplies stored away for harsh weather. Just him, the cave, and his practice. He ate nettles. Only nettles. Not because he was following some extreme diet plan, but because nettles were the only thing that grew near his cave. Day after day, month after month, year after year, boiled nettles when he had fuel for fire, raw nettles when he didn't. His body began to change. His skin turned greenish from the nettles. His hair fell out in clumps. He became so thin that every bone showed through his skin. He was cold constantly, hunger a permanent companion, his body breaking down from deprivation. Sometimes, hunters would pass near his cave and see this strange green creature huddled in the entrance, barely human. They thought he was a demon or a ghost. They would throw stones, shout at him to leave, threaten him. Milarepa would just sit there, watching them with calm eyes, saying nothing. His sister came once, horrified by what she found. "Brother, you're dying," she wept. "This practice is killing you. Come home. Eat real food. Live like a human being." Milarepa smiled at her gently. "I am more alive now than I ever was living comfortably. What looks like death to you is actually life to me." She didn't understand. How could suffering bring life? How could deprivation create strength? How could someone wasting away in a freezing cave claim to be thriving? But something was happening in that cave that had nothing to do with physical comfort. When you have nothing, you discover what you actually are. When the body is weakened, the mind can grow incredibly strong. When external supports are stripped away, internal strength must develop, or you die. Milarepa wasn't torturing himself for religious merit. He wasn't trying to prove his spiritual superiority. He was conducting an experiment in the deepest laboratory possible, his own consciousness under extreme conditions. He wanted to know what remained when everything comfortable was removed. He wanted to discover what mind could do when body was reduced to almost nothing. He wanted to understand if peace was possible in the worst circumstances imaginable. And he discovered something that changes how we understand strength entirely. Most of us build strength by adding things. We eat more protein to build muscle. We acquire more knowledge to feel confident. We surround ourselves with comforts to feel secure. We accumulate possessions, relationships, achievements, trying to feel strong by having more. Milarepa discovered strength by removing everything until only essence remained. In the cave, he couldn't distract himself from his mind. No entertainment, no companionship, no variation in routine to break up the monotony. Just him and his thoughts, hour after hour, day after day, facing everything he'd been avoiding his entire life. Fear came up. In the darkness, listening to wolves howl outside, feeling his body weaken from hunger, watching storms that could easily kill him. Fear was constant. But with nowhere to run from it, Milarepa learned to sit with fear until it revealed its nature. Fear wasn't a thing. It was a pattern of thoughts and sensations. When he stopped fighting it, it lost its power. Loneliness came up. Months would pass with no human contact. The silence was so complete, it felt like being the only person left alive. But in that loneliness, Milarepa discovered something strange. He was never actually alone. Awareness was always there, experiencing everything. The mind that watched loneliness was itself not lonely. Anger came up. Rage at his teacher for the harsh training that led him here. Fury at circumstances beyond his control. Resentment about the unfairness of suffering. But burning in that anger year after year, he discovered something profound. Anger was fuel. Not fuel for hatred, but fuel for transformation when directed wisely. Despair came up. Days when he thought he'd made a terrible mistake, when continuing seemed pointless, when death would be easier than one more day of cold and hunger. But each time despair threatened to overwhelm him, he found that just beneath it was something unbreakable, some part of awareness that could witness even despair without being destroyed by it. Gradually, through years of this crucible, Milarepa's mind became like steel, forged in fire. Not hard and brittle, but strong and flexible. He developed capacity to remain steady through anything. When hunters threw stones, he felt no anger. When cold bit through his thin robe, he felt no complaint. When hunger gnawed at his belly, he felt no desperation. Not because he'd become numb, but because he'd discovered a layer of consciousness that wasn't touched by these conditions. This is what Buddhist practice actually points toward. Not becoming superhuman, not transcending being human, but discovering the part of you that's already free, right in the middle of suffering. You don't need to live in a cave eating nettles to access this, but you do need to stop running from difficulty. Think about how you handle hardship currently. Something challenging happens, and your first instinct is to escape it, fix it, distract from it, make it go away as fast as possible. You reach for food, screens, substances, shopping, anything to avoid feeling what's uncomfortable. This makes perfect sense. Pain hurts. Discomfort is unpleasant. Why would anyone choose to feel difficult things? But here's what Milarepa discovered. Avoiding difficulty keeps you weak. Every time you run from discomfort, you reinforce the belief that you can't handle it. Every time you distract from pain, you miss the opportunity to develop capacity. The muscle that allows you to sit with difficulty only grows through actually sitting with difficulty. The strength to endure comes only through enduring. The peace that exists even in chaos is found only by remaining present in chaos. This doesn't mean seeking out suffering. Milarepa wasn't a masochist enjoying deprivation. It means not wasting the suffering that life naturally brings. When you're going through something hard, you have a choice. You can numb it, distract from it, complain about it, while learning nothing from it. Or you can turn toward it with awareness and discover what it's teaching. The insomnia that won't let you sleep, instead of fighting it desperately, what happens if you just lie there awake, watching the mind, getting curious about what insomnia actually feels like when you're not resisting it? The grief that keeps returning, instead of trying to get over it faster, what happens if you let yourself feel it completely, learning its texture, its waves, its eventual transformation? The anxiety that tightens your chest, instead of immediately trying to make it go away, what happens if you stay present with the sensations, breathing into them, discovering they can't actually destroy you? The loneliness that aches in your bones, instead of frantically filling the space with noise and activity, what happens if you sit in the loneliness until you discover what exists underneath it? This is Milarepa's cave for modern life. Not literal deprivation, but choosing to stay present with difficulty instead of running. He discovered that mind can bear far more than body can. That consciousness can remain aware even when everything else is falling apart. That peace doesn't require comfortable conditions. It's accessible right in the middle of the storm. After years in the cave, Milarepa emerged with realization so complete that even his teacher was astonished. His body was wrecked, but his mind was diamond. He had nothing but possessed everything. He looked like he was dying, but had never been more alive. He spent the rest of his life teaching, and people were drawn to him, not because he was comfortable or successful, but because he radiated a freedom that didn't depend on circumstances. He'd found the indestructible core through destroying everything destructible. Tonight, if you're in your own cave, whatever form it takes, remember this. Difficulty isn't just something to survive. It's the forge where real strength is built. Every moment, you can stay present with discomfort without running is a moment you're growing capacity you didn't have before. Milarepa turned green from nettles. His body deteriorated. He suffered cold and hunger for years. But he emerged with something no comfortable life could have given him: absolute certainty that consciousness can remain free, regardless of conditions. You have access to this same discovery, not through living in a cave, but through stopping the constant escape from what's difficult in your life right now. The Buddha taught that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Milarepa proved this in the most extreme laboratory possible. Physical pain, hunger, cold, isolation, all inevitable in his cave. But suffering, the mental torment about those conditions, gradually dissolved as he learned to meet difficulty without adding resistance to it. This is the teaching. Build strength not by avoiding hardship, but by developing capacity to remain aware within it. Find freedom not by changing circumstances, but by discovering the part of you that's already free. The cave is wherever you are right now, with exactly the difficulties you're facing. And the strength Milarepa found is available to you too, if you stop running long enough to let it develop. Before the Buddha was the Buddha, he was a man named Siddhartha who was starving himself to death. For 6 years he'd practiced the most extreme asceticism imaginable. He reduced his food intake to a single grain of rice per day, then to nothing at all. His body became skeletal, his ribs protruding like bamboo poles, his skin hanging loose over bones. When he touched his stomach, he could feel his spine. He believed that liberation required destroying the body's hold over consciousness. So he sat in meditation for days without moving, practiced breath retention until he passed out, exposed himself to extreme heat and cold, pushed his body to the absolute edge of survival. 5 other ascetics practiced with him, all of them committed to this path of self-mortification. They watched each other waste away, each secretly proud of how much they could endure, how close to death they could come in pursuit of enlightenment. One evening, Siddhartha sat by the river and realized something that shattered everything he'd believed. His mind was too weak to meditate properly. His body was too damaged to sustain awareness. He was close to dying, but no closer to understanding than when he'd started. This path was wrong. Torturing the body didn't free the mind. It just created a different kind of prison. He decided to eat. Nearby lived a woman named Sujata. She wasn't wealthy or educated or particularly spiritual. She was a dairy farmer's daughter who'd married young and struggled to have children. For years, she'd prayed to the tree spirit that lived in a particular banyan tree near her village. "If you grant me a son, I will make you the finest offering I can prepare." Eventually, she had a son, and Sujata never forgot her vow. On the day Siddhartha decided to break his fast, Sujata was preparing her offering to the tree spirit. She took milk from her best cow, cooked it with rice until it became a thick, nourishing porridge, and added honey from wild bees. She worked all morning, stirring slowly over the fire, making this simple dish as perfect as she could. This offering represented enormous sacrifice. Rice and honey weren't cheap for a poor farming family. The milk came from a cow they needed for daily survival. She was giving from scarcity, not abundance, and the cost was real. When she carried her offering to the banyan tree, she saw a figure sitting beneath it. Even emaciated and filthy, Siddhartha had a presence that made her catch her breath. She thought he must be the tree spirit manifested in human form to receive her offering. She approached with deep reverence and offered him the bowl of rice milk. "Please accept this humble offering," she said, bowing low. Siddhartha looked at the bowl. It was warm, fragrant, the rice milk thick and golden with honey. His body screamed for it, but his mind hesitated. If he accepted food, his fellow ascetics would see him as weak, as having failed, as abandoning the path. Then he realized their judgment didn't matter. This woman was offering from her heart, from her poverty, from her gratitude. To reject her offering because of spiritual pride would be its own kind of delusion. He accepted the bowl and ate. The rice milk tasted like life returning. With each mouthful, he felt strength flowing back into his wasted body. Not just physical strength, but clarity returning to his mind. He had been so wrong about what practice required. When the 5 ascetics saw him eating, they were disgusted. "Siddhartha has given up," they said to each other. "He's returned to indulgence. He was never serious about liberation." They left him there, convinced he'd failed. But Siddhartha hadn't failed. He'd finally understood. The body and mind aren't enemies to be defeated. They're instruments that need care to function properly. You can't reach liberation by destroying the vehicle that carries awareness. That night, nourished by Sujata's gift, he sat beneath a different tree and made a vow. He wouldn't move from that spot until he understood the nature of suffering completely. And he didn't move. For hours, then days, his mind went deeper than it had ever gone when his body was wasting away. He saw how craving creates suffering, how ignorance perpetuates it, how liberation is possible through direct understanding. When dawn came, he was awake in a way he'd never been before. The man who sat down was still seeking. The man who stood up had found what he was seeking. Sujata never knew she'd fed the future Buddha. She went back to her simple life, raising her son, milking cows, making offerings when she could afford them. She gave that bowl of rice milk, thinking it would earn her spiritual merit. She had no idea it would change the course of human consciousness. This story sits at the intersection of giving and receiving, of poverty and abundance, of meaning found in the smallest acts. Sujata had almost nothing. Her life was hard, her resources limited, her future uncertain. But when it came time to fulfill her vow, she didn't give from leftovers. She gave the best she had. She didn't calculate whether the tree spirit deserved such an offering. She didn't wonder if anyone would notice or appreciate her sacrifice. She didn't resent the cost or give half-heartedly. She prepared that rice milk with complete attention, complete devotion, complete generosity. Buddhism teaches that the quality of giving matters more than the quantity. Someone wealthy who drops a coin in a donation box without thinking gives less than someone poor who offers their last piece of bread with full heart. Sujata gave from scarcity with the same wholeness that others give from abundance. That wholeness is what made her gift powerful. But there's another teaching hidden in this story. Siddhartha's acceptance of the gift was itself an act of grace. He could have refused, citing his spiritual discipline. He could have explained that he was beyond such offerings. He could have sent her away to protect his reputation with the other ascetics. Instead, he received. He allowed himself to be helped when he desperately needed help. He let this poor woman's generosity matter. Let it feed him. Let it change the course of his practice. Sometimes receiving is harder than giving. To receive requires acknowledging need, accepting help, letting someone else's generosity touch you. Siddhartha's spiritual pride wanted to refuse, but his wisdom allowed him to receive with gratitude. This exchange between Sujata and Siddhartha shows something essential about how transformation happens. She gave what little she had. He received what he desperately needed. Neither of them understood the full significance of the moment, but their mutual sincerity created something that changed the world. When you're going through hardship, it's easy to believe you have nothing to offer. You're barely surviving. How could you possibly give to anyone else? You're the one who needs help, not the one who can provide it. Sujata teaches differently. She was poor, struggling, living hand to mouth, but she found meaning in hardship by remaining generous within it. She didn't wait until she was wealthy to fulfill her vow. She gave from exactly where she was. Your hardship doesn't disqualify you from generosity. Sometimes hardship is exactly what qualifies you, because you understand what it's like to need, to struggle, to barely make it through. The kindness you offer someone when you yourself are suffering carries a weight that comfortable kindness never can. When you're drowning and you still reach out to someone else who's drowning, that connection means everything. And here's what Sujata's story reveals about meaning in hardship. She didn't find meaning by escaping poverty, or by resenting it, or by making it define her. She found meaning by remaining generous despite it. Her life was hard, but hardship didn't make her hard. Scarcity didn't make her stingy. Struggle didn't close her heart. She kept her capacity to give intact, even when she had little to give from. This is what Buddhism points toward constantly. Your circumstances don't determine your spiritual capacity. Suffering doesn't prevent practice. It can deepen it. Having little doesn't mean being little. Think about what you're holding back because you think it's not enough. The encouragement you don't offer because your own life isn't perfect. The help you don't give because you yourself need help. The kindness you withhold because you're not in a position to solve someone's whole problem. Sujata didn't solve Siddhartha's spiritual crisis. She just offered rice milk. But that simple act at the right moment changed everything. You don't know what your small offering might mean to someone. You don't know how your struggling but still generous heart might touch another struggling heart in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. The Buddha later said that if people understood the power of generosity as he understood it, they wouldn't let a single day pass without giving something. Not because giving earns you points in some cosmic accounting system, but because generosity itself is freedom. When you give from scarcity, you prove to yourself that scarcity doesn't control you. When you offer kindness while suffering, you demonstrate that suffering hasn't conquered you. When you remain generous in hardship, you transcend hardship without leaving it. Sujata went back to milking cows and raising children and living simply. But she lived knowing she'd kept her vow, knowing she'd given her best, knowing she hadn't let poverty make her petty. That's the meaning hardship can hold. Not escaping it, or transcending it, or being rewarded for surviving it, but remaining fully human within it, generous, open-hearted, still capable of giving, even when you have little. Tonight, if you're facing scarcity of any kind, money, energy, time, hope, remember this. Sujata was poor. She gave rice milk. It fed the Buddha. He achieved enlightenment. He taught for 45 years. Millions have been helped by his teaching across 25 centuries. All of it traces back to one poor woman who didn't let poverty stop her from giving. You don't need abundance to be generous. You need willingness to give what you have, exactly as it is, exactly as you are. That's always enough. The Buddha said that even offering a glass of water with a pure heart plants seeds of immeasurable benefit. Not because the water is special, but because the heart that offers it transforms both giver and receiver. Your hardship is real. Your scarcity is real. And your capacity to remain generous within it is what gives both meaning In ancient India, your birth determined everything. Not just your occupation, but your worth as a human being, your spiritual potential, even whether holy texts could be spoken in your presence. The caste system was absolute. Brahmins at the top, priests and scholars who claimed spiritual authority by birthright. Warriors and rulers next, merchants and farmers below them, and at the bottom, those who worked with their hands in service occupations. Upali was born into the lowest category. A barber. His job was to cut hair and shave the faces of higher caste men who wouldn't dream of learning such skills themselves. He was necessary, but despised, needed, but never respected. He could touch their heads, but couldn't sit at their tables. He could serve them intimately, but could never be their equal. Every morning, Upali went to the homes of wealthy families. He'd wait at the back entrance, never the front. He'd be summoned when convenient for them, never when convenient for him. He'd perform his work with skill while they discussed philosophy and Dharma as if he wasn't there. Sometimes they'd talk about the new teacher, the Buddha, who was saying radical things about spiritual practice. Upali would listen while trimming beards and shaping hair, absorbing teachings that weren't meant for someone like him. One day, several young men from noble families decided to join the Buddha's community. They were Shakyan princes, the Buddha's own relatives, men of the highest birth and privilege. They prepared to leave their wealth and status behind to become monks. These princes employed Upali as their personal barber. As they prepared to renounce the world, they called him to perform one final service, to shave their heads before ordination. Upali shaved their heads, knowing this was the last time he'd serve them. They'd be monks now, living simply, and they wouldn't need a barber's services anymore. He felt the familiar ache of being necessary until he wasn't, useful until they moved beyond needing him. Then, one of the princes said something that changed everything. "We're going to the Buddha to become monks. You should come with us, Upali." Upali stared at him. "Me? I'm a barber. People like me don't become monks. I don't have the right birth, the right education, the right anything." "The Buddha teaches that birth doesn't determine spiritual capacity," the prince said. "Come with us and see." So Upali went, expecting to be turned away, expecting to be told this path wasn't for people like him. But when they arrived, the Buddha did something that shocked everyone present. He ordained Upali first. Before the princes, before the men of noble birth and high education, the Buddha ordained the barber. And according to monastic protocol, seniority is determined by ordination order, not by birth caste. Which meant Upali was now senior to princes. Men who'd employed him days ago now had to bow to him. Men who wouldn't have sat at a table with him now had to treat him as their elder in the Dharma. The Buddha did this deliberately. He was making a statement that birth means nothing, that practice means everything, that the spiritual path is open to anyone, regardless of where society has placed them. But being ordained was just the beginning. Upali had to actually practice, had to prove that the Buddha's faith in him wasn't misplaced. And he did. Upali threw himself into understanding the monastic discipline with the same meticulous attention he'd once given to cutting hair. Every rule, every protocol, every subtle point of monastic conduct, he studied it all with extraordinary care. He had to work harder than the others. They'd grown up studying sacred texts. He'd grown up cutting hair. They had years of education behind them. He was starting from nothing. But Upali had something they didn't. He knew what it meant to be underestimated. He knew what it meant to have everything stacked against you. He knew what it took to excel when no one expected you to even try. He became the foremost expert in the monastic code. When questions arose about proper conduct, the Buddha would defer to Upali. When disputes needed resolution, according to the rules, Upali would clarify. The barber became the authority on how monks should live. After the Buddha died, the senior monks gathered to preserve his teachings. They chose Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant, to recite all the discourses he'd memorized. And they chose Upali to recite the entire monastic code from memory. Upali stood before 500 enlightened monks and recited thousands of rules and protocols without a single error. The man who society said couldn't even hear sacred teachings was now the one preserving them for future generations. This wasn't just personal triumph. This was proof that the Buddha's teaching worked, that human potential isn't determined by birth or circumstance, that practice transforms anyone who applies it sincerely. Think about what Upali faced. Not just external barriers, those were obvious. The deeper challenge was internal. When you're told your entire life that you're lesser, that voice gets inside you. It becomes the way you see yourself. You don't just face discrimination from others. You discriminate against yourself. Upali could have refused the invitation to ordain, convinced it wasn't for someone like him. He could have sabotaged himself through doubt, proving society right about his limitations. He could have given up when the study got hard, accepting that he just wasn't smart enough. But he didn't. He took the opportunity he was given and made it count through sheer dedication. Buddhism teaches that what you are is not what you were born as. You're not defined by circumstances of birth, by family status, by what society has decided about people like you. You're defined by what you do with awareness, with practice, with sincere effort. Upali proved this absolutely. The system said he was untouchable spiritually. The Buddha said everyone has the same potential for awakening. Upali's life proved the Buddha right and the system wrong. But here's what matters for you right now, wherever you are. Maybe you weren't born into a literal caste system, but you've probably internalized messages about what people like you can and cannot do. Maybe it's about education. You didn't go to the right schools, so certain paths must be closed. Maybe it's about age. You're too old to start something new, too young to be taken seriously. Maybe it's about background, where you come from, how you grew up, the opportunities you didn't have. Maybe it's about identity, your gender, your race, your sexuality, your neurology, your body. Society has probably told you stories about what these things mean, what they limit, what they make impossible. The Buddha's teaching is that these limitations are constructed, not inherent. They're real in the sense that society enforces them, but they're not real in the sense that they actually determine your capacity. Upali couldn't change his birth caste. That was a fixed fact of his society, but he could refuse to let it determine his spiritual development, his dedication to practice, his eventual mastery. You can't always change external circumstances. Discrimination is real. Barriers are real. The obstacles placed in front of certain people are genuinely harder than what others face. Acknowledging this matters. But you can refuse to internalize those limitations as truth about your actual potential. You can work twice as hard if that's what's required. You can prove the doubters wrong by becoming undeniable. Upali didn't just become a decent monk despite his background. He became the foremost authority in his area of expertise. He didn't settle for being allowed into the community. He excelled within it. This matters because settling for good enough given my circumstances is still internalizing the limitation. It's still accepting that you should be measured by a different standard because of where you started. The Buddha measured everyone by the same standard: sincerity of practice, depth of understanding, quality of conduct. Upali met that standard completely, not approximately. When the former princes had to bow to their former barber, it wasn't charity or token inclusion. It was recognition of genuine accomplishment. Upali had earned their respect through actual mastery, not through anyone lowering the bar. So what are you not attempting because you've decided it's not for people like you? What have you ruled out before even trying because of messages you've absorbed about your limitations? The voice that says you can't is often just society speaking through you. It sounds like truth because you've heard it so many times, but it's opinion, not fact. Upali proved that decisively. Start where you are. Use what you have. Work with what you know, even if it's less than what others started with. The path is open, regardless of where you begin. And when you face doubt, yours or others, remember the barber who became the authority. Remember that the Buddha looked at Upali and saw not his caste, not his lack of education, not his humble origins. He saw human potential ready to be developed through practice. That same potential exists in you, not because you're special, but because everyone has it. Not because the path is easy, but because it's available. Not because society will support you, but because practice works regardless of what society thinks. Tonight, if you've been told what you cannot become, remember this. Upali cut hair for nobles who wouldn't acknowledge him as fully human. He became the monk they had to bow to. He preserved the Buddha's teaching for all future generations. He proved that birth determines nothing, and practice determines everything. The Buddha said clearly, "Not by birth is one noble, by action is one noble." Upali lived that teaching. So can you. Maudgalyayana was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples, known for abilities that went beyond ordinary perception. He could see into realms most people never glimpse, could travel through states of consciousness that remain hidden to untrained minds. One day, the Buddha asked him to use these abilities for a specific purpose. "Go to the hell realms," the Buddha said. "Witness what's there. Then return and teach others what you've seen." So Maudgalyayana descended. The first realm he entered was a place of such intense suffering that most minds would shatter just from witnessing it. Beings were burning in flames that came from their own hatred, flames that consumed but never destroyed, leaving them to burn endlessly. He saw a being whose body was one vast wound, skinless, every nerve exposed. The slightest movement brought agony, but the being couldn't stop moving because vultures were tearing at the exposed flesh. This had been a butcher in a previous life who'd taken joy in causing animals pain. Now he experienced what he'd inflicted, magnified beyond measure. He saw a woman whose mouth was impossibly small, her throat the width of a needle, her belly swollen like a mountain. She was perpetually starving, perpetually seeking food she could never consume. She'd been someone who hoarded wealth while others starved, who ate lavishly while refusing to share even scraps. Now she felt the hunger she'd ignored in others. He saw a man trapped in a frozen wasteland, his body locked in ice so cold it burned like fire. He'd been someone whose heart was cold to others' suffering, who'd looked at people in need and felt nothing. Now, he experienced the coldness he'd shown others as actual freezing that never numbed, never granted the mercy of unconsciousness. Realm after realm, Maudgalyayana witnessed suffering so extreme that words fail to capture it. Not torture imposed from outside, but suffering that arose naturally from actions, from karma working itself through to completion. And through all of this, Maudgalyayana remained stable. His heart didn't harden to protect itself from what he was seeing. His mind didn't fragment under the weight of witnessing such agony. He didn't turn away, didn't dissociate, didn't collapse into despair about the nature of existence. He stayed present, aware, compassionate, and whole. When he returned, the Buddha's other disciples asked him how he'd survived witnessing such horror. How had he not been destroyed by what he'd seen? Maudgalyayana's answer reveals something crucial about working with suffering. I understood 3 things clearly, he said. First, that this suffering was impermanent. As terrible as it was, it would eventually exhaust itself. Nothing lasts forever, not even hell. Second, I understood that these beings were experiencing the natural results of their own actions. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty from a punishing God. It was cause and effect working through consciousness. Understanding this kept me from adding the suffering of outrage or despair to what I was witnessing. Third, I maintained awareness that I was witnessing, not experiencing. The suffering was real for those beings, but I wasn't those beings. I could be fully present with their pain, without becoming that pain myself. This teaching matters for anyone who witnesses suffering as part of their work or life. A therapist sits across from someone describing abuse so severe it seems impossible to bear. If the therapist takes that pain into themselves, carries it home, lies awake, replaying the stories, they'll burn out within months. But if they harden their heart to protect themselves, they lose the capacity for genuine compassion that makes healing possible. Maudgalyayana's path is the middle way between these extremes. Fully present, fully feeling, but not identified with the suffering witnessed. A social worker enters homes where neglect has created conditions that shock the conscience. Children living in filth, hunger, chaos that no child should endure. The social worker must see it clearly, document it accurately, feel the full weight of what's wrong. But if they collapse under that weight, they can't help. If they harden themselves until they feel nothing, they become another source of harm. The balance Maudgalyayana found was in understanding impermanence deeply. This situation exists now. It won't exist forever. Suffering this intense contains within itself the seeds of change, because nothing can sustain that intensity indefinitely. An emergency room nurse sees trauma that most people never imagine. Bodies broken by violence, overdoses, accidents that turn ordinary days into tragedy. Night after night, shift after shift, the same emergency room becomes a place where the fragility of human life is undeniable. Some nurses quit because they can't stop carrying the suffering home. Others develop a callousness that makes them effective but cruel, making dark jokes about patients to create distance from pain. But some find the middle path. They remain tender enough to treat each person with genuine care, strong enough to witness horror without fragmenting, wise enough to understand that what they're seeing is real but not permanent, individual but not unique to these particular people. A war correspondent documents atrocities in conflict zones. They've seen villages destroyed, civilians murdered, children orphaned by violence that serves no purpose beyond inflicting suffering. Their job requires bearing witness, making sure the world knows what's happening. If they become numb to protect themselves, they lose the ability to tell stories that convey the reality of what they're seeing. If they take all that suffering into themselves without boundaries, they develop trauma that makes continuing impossible. Maudgalyayana's teaching offers a third option. See clearly, feel fully, but maintain awareness that you are the witness, not the sufferer. This isn't coldness, it's clarity that allows sustained presence with pain. A hospice worker accompanies dying patients through their final days. Some deaths are peaceful, but others involve suffering that medical intervention can only partly address. The worker sits with people in their worst moments, witnesses fear and pain and desperate attempts to hold on to life that's slipping away. The work requires staying open to each person's experience without carrying every death as a personal loss. The hospice worker who identified completely with each patient's suffering would collapse under accumulated grief. The one who armored themselves against feeling couldn't offer the genuine presence that dying people need. Maudgalyayana's path allows full presence without self-destruction. Understanding impermanence. This person's suffering is real now, and it will end. Understanding causality. Suffering arises from conditions, not from cosmic cruelty. Maintaining witness consciousness. I am here with this person, not merged into their experience. A journalist investigates human trafficking and finds victims whose stories reveal systematic cruelty designed to break human spirits. The journalist must hear these stories, must understand them well enough to convey them accurately, must let them impact deeply enough to write with genuine feeling. But carrying all that trauma without boundaries leads to breakdown. Becoming desensitized to it means losing the capacity to tell stories that move others to action. The Buddhist teaching is that compassion without wisdom burns out, while wisdom without compassion grows cold. Moudgalyayana demonstrated compassion that was sustainable because it was grounded in wisdom about the nature of suffering. So how do you practice this when you witness suffering? First, recognize that witnessing is not the same as experiencing. You can be fully present with someone's pain without that pain becoming yours. Their suffering is real, and you don't need to take it into yourself for it to matter. Second, remember impermanence actively. This moment of suffering exists now. It won't exist forever. Even the worst agony shifts and changes, and eventually ends. This isn't minimizing suffering, it's understanding its nature accurately. Third, understand causality without blame. Suffering arises from conditions, not from random cruelty or cosmic punishment. This doesn't make it less real, but it makes it comprehensible in a way that prevents the additional suffering of outrage or despair. Fourth, maintain the distinction between compassion and merger. You can feel genuine care for someone without losing the boundary between your experience and theirs. That boundary isn't coldness, it's what allows sustained presence. Fifth, recognize that your stability serves others. When Moudgalyayana returned from the hell realms intact, he could teach what he'd seen. If he'd been destroyed by witnessing, that knowledge would have been lost. Your ability to remain whole while witnessing suffering allows you to help in ways that someone overwhelmed cannot. Tonight, if you carry the weight of what you've witnessed, suffering you've seen in others, pain you couldn't prevent, darkness that touched your life through proximity if not direct experience, remember this. Moudgalyayana descended into the hell realms and returned whole. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that witnessing and experiencing are different. Not because the suffering wasn't real, but because he knew it was impermanent. Not because he hardened his heart, but because wisdom protected compassion from burning out. The Buddha said that a mind established in the four immeasurables, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, cannot be overwhelmed by what it encounters. Not because these qualities make you invulnerable, but because they allow you to remain present with suffering without being destroyed by it. You can witness hell without becoming it. You can hold space for another's pain without that pain consuming you. You can remain tender enough to care and strong enough to endure. This is what Moggalliyana proved. This is what remains possible for you. The Buddha's cousin Devadatta wanted him dead, not out of sudden rage, but from years of festering jealousy that had curdled into murderous intent. Devadatta had tried poison, tried hiring assassins, tried rolling a boulder down a mountain onto the Buddha's head. Each attempt had failed, not because the Buddha used any special power, but because when people approached him, intending harm, something in his presence made violence suddenly seem impossible. So Devadatta conceived a plan that didn't rely on human agents who might lose their nerve. He would use an animal, specifically an elephant named Nalagiri, known throughout the region for his massive size and normally gentle temperament. Devadatta waited until he knew the Buddha would be walking through a particular narrow street in the city of Rajagaha. Then he took Nalagiri, fed him large quantities of alcohol until the elephant was completely drunk, and released him directly into the Buddha's path. A drunk elephant is a terrifying thing. All that massive power with no restraint, no capacity for reason, just pure aggressive energy looking for something to destroy. Nalagiri came thundering down the street, trumpeting rage, ears flapping, tusks lowered for goring. People screamed and scattered, pressing themselves against walls, diving into doorways, grabbing children, and running. The ground shook with each step. Buildings seemed to tremble. This was several tons of drunk, enraged elephant charging at full speed through a crowded city street. The Buddha's attendant Ananda tried to step in front of him, tried to shield him with his own body. The other monks panicked, shouting for the Buddha to run, to turn back, to do something before the elephant reached him. The Buddha kept walking forward, not slowly, not dramatically, just at his normal walking pace, directly toward the charging elephant. His face showed no fear, no anger at Devadatta's attempt on his life, no concern about what was thundering toward him. Just complete calm, complete presence, complete openness. As Nalagiri got closer, something began to shift in the elephant. The drunken rage that had been driving him started to waver. His charge slowed slightly, not from physical exhaustion, but from some other force entirely. 20 feet away, then 10, the elephant was still moving forward, but the murderous intent was draining out of him. By the time Nalagiri reached the Buddha, the charge had become a walk, then a shuffle, then a complete stop. The massive elephant stood in front of the Buddha, swaying slightly from the alcohol, but calm. Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone watching, Nalagiri lowered his huge head and trunk to the ground in a bow. The Buddha reached out and touched the elephant's head gently, speaking to him in a low voice that the crowd couldn't hear. Nalagiri's eyes, which had been wild and rolling with aggression moments before, became clear and peaceful. The Buddha stood there for several minutes with his hand on the elephant, the street completely silent except for the Buddha's quiet words. Then Nalagiri turned and walked away slowly, all aggression gone, and never showed violent behavior again. This story is usually told to show the Buddha's miraculous power over animals, but that misses the real teaching entirely. The Buddha didn't use any special power to stop Nalagiri. He did something much more radical. He met violence with complete non-violence, aggression with perfect peace, and that meeting itself transformed the situation. Think about what he didn't do. He didn't run, which would have triggered the elephant's chase instinct even more strongly. He didn't fight, which would have been ridiculous against an elephant, but also would have escalated the energy of violence. He didn't freeze in fear, which animals can sense, and which often increases their aggression. He walked forward calmly, completely present, radiating something that the elephant's consciousness recognized even through drunkenness and rage. That recognition stopped Nalagiri more effectively than any force could have. This matters because most of us face our own charging elephants regularly. A co-worker storms into your workspace, face red, voice already raised, ready to unload about something you supposedly did wrong. Your body tenses immediately, preparing for fight or flight. Your mind races through defensive strategies, counter-accusations, ways to deflect blame. What if you did what the Buddha did instead? Just stood there, present and calm, not defending, not attacking, not running, just meeting their aggression with steady peace. A driver cuts you off dangerously, then when you honk, follows you for 3 blocks screaming and making threatening gestures. Your hands grip the wheel, your breathing gets shallow, you're calculating escape routes while rage builds at their insanity. What if you stopped feeding the escalation? Just drove calmly, didn't respond to the gestures, didn't engage with the crazy, just remained steady until the other person's rage burned itself out with nothing to sustain it. Someone in your family brings up the topic that always explodes into argument. You feel the familiar surge of defensive anger, the words forming in your mind that will cut them down, prove them wrong, win the fight. What if you breathed instead? Let them finish speaking without interrupting, without mentally composing rebuttals while they talk. Responded calmly, even if they don't. Refuse to let their escalation trigger yours. This isn't about being passive or letting people walk over you. The Buddha walked directly toward the elephant. That's not passive, but he walked calmly, without aggression, and that made all the difference. There's a principle in conflict that most people never learn. escalation requires participation. A fight needs at least two people feeding energy into it. When one person refuses to escalate, the dynamic can't sustain itself. A customer is screaming at a store employee about a policy the employee didn't create and can't change. The employee has two options: escalate by getting defensive and angry back, or de-escalate by staying calm and present. Every time the employee remains calm, the customer's rage has nowhere to go. It bounces off the employee's peace, instead of finding matching aggression to amplify it. Eventually, most people can't sustain that level of anger when it's not being fed by reaction. A teenager slams into the house, screaming about how unfair everything is, how much they hate their life, throwing blame in every direction. The parent can match that energy with their own anger and frustration, or they can do what the Buddha did. Stay present, stay calm, let the storm rage without becoming storm themselves. Not dismissing the teenager's feelings, not invalidating their pain, just refusing to escalate, refusing to let the teenager's chaos create chaos in them. This requires something most people don't have: genuine equanimity in the face of aggression. Not fake calm, that's actually suppressed rage, but real peace that comes from understanding something deeper about anger and violence. The Buddha understood that Nalagiri wasn't evil. He was drunk, confused, manipulated into aggression by Devadatta. The elephant's true nature wasn't violent. Violence was a temporary state imposed on him. When you understand this about people who come at you with aggression, everything shifts. They're not evil. They're hurting. They're not your enemy. They're suffering and lashing out from that suffering. Their aggression isn't who they are. It's what they're experiencing right now. This understanding doesn't require you to accept abuse or stay in dangerous situations. The Buddha could have walked away from Nalagiri. He chose to walk toward him, but walking away would have been equally valid. The key was walking calmly either direction, not running in panic, not fighting in rage. A person in an abusive relationship finally leaves. They don't stay to prove they can remain calm in the face of violence. That would be foolish. But they also don't leave consumed by hatred. Don't let the other person's toxicity poison them. They leave with clear boundaries and steady resolve, not with matching aggression. This is the hardest practice for most people. When someone comes at us with aggression, every instinct says either fight back harder or run away, panicking. The middle path, staying present, staying calm, meeting aggression with peace, feels impossible. But it's what transforms situations that violence would only make worse. Nalagiri bowed because the Buddha's peace was stronger than Devadatta's manipulation. The elephant's true nature recognized something in the Buddha that cut through the confusion and rage. Most people you encounter in rage are like drunk elephants. Their true nature is obscured by whatever has intoxicated them with anger. Meeting them with calm presence gives their true nature a chance to emerge. Sometimes it works immediately, like with Nalagiri. Sometimes it takes longer. Sometimes the other person isn't ready to calm down and you need to create distance. But your calm presence never makes things worse, while your escalation almost always does. Tonight, if you know you're going to face someone's aggression tomorrow, remember this. The Buddha walked toward a drunk elephant that everyone knew would kill him. He walked calmly, with complete presence, with perfect peace, and the elephant bowed. You won't always get a bow, but you'll never make things worse by staying calm. You'll never regret refusing to escalate. You'll never damage yourself by maintaining your peace, even when others have lost theirs. The Buddha taught that hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone. Nalagiri proved this teaching absolutely. Violence met with violence multiplies. Violence met with peace transforms. This is the path. Not passive acceptance of abuse, but active maintenance of peace in the face of aggression. Not weakness that runs or collapses, but strength that stands firm without attacking. The charging elephant stops when it meets something it can't overwhelm. Not greater violence, but deeper peace. Mahanama was not a monk. He was a wealthy householder, a member of the Shakyan clan, the same clan the Buddha had been born into before his renunciation. He had a successful life by any external measure: property, status, a respected position in his community. But he was terrified of dying. Not in the abstract way. Most people fear death, pushing it to the back of their minds until some future crisis forces it forward. Mahanama's fear was immediate, consuming, present every single day. He would wake in the night with his heart racing, convinced he was dying right then. He would watch his own breath, monitoring every sensation in his body for signs of impending death. He'd been practicing Buddhism for years. He'd taken refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the monastic community. He'd studied the teachings, made generous offerings, lived ethically. By all accounts, he was an accomplished practitioner, someone who understood the Dharma intellectually and applied it practically. But none of it touched his terror of death. He would sit in meditation, and within minutes, his mind would spiral into death anxiety. What happens when I die? Where do I go? Will I cease to exist completely? Will I be reborn in a hell realm? The questions churned relentlessly, creating so much fear that meditation became another source of suffering rather than relief from it. Finally, Mahanama went to the Buddha directly. He approached with the desperation of someone who'd tried everything else and found no peace. Blessed One, he said, his voice tight with years of accumulated fear, I practice the Dharma as you've taught. I live ethically, I meditate, I understand impermanence intellectually, but I'm terrified of dying. The fear never leaves me. I wake up afraid. I go to sleep afraid. I carry this terror every moment. What happens to someone like me when they die? The Buddha looked at him with complete understanding. This wasn't the first time someone had come to him with death, anxiety, and it wouldn't be the last. But Mahanama's question was specific, not just about death in general, but about his own death, about what happens to a lay practitioner who's lived ethically but still carries fear. The Buddha's answer was unusual. He didn't offer abstract philosophy about the nature of death or reassuring platitudes about everything being okay. Instead, he told Mahanama to consider what he'd been training his mind in all these years. Mahanama, when you're mindful during the day, what are you mindful of? The Buddha asked. Mahanama thought about this. I try to be mindful of generosity, of ethical conduct, of the Dharma teachings, of the qualities of the awakened ones. And when fear arises, where does your mind go? To death, Mahanama admitted. To what happens after, to whether I'll suffer, to whether I'll be lost. The Buddha nodded. Your mind has been training itself for years in fear of death. You've practiced that fear more consistently than you've practiced anything else. Every time death anxiety arises and you follow it, ruminate on it, let it consume your attention, you're strengthening that pattern. You've become an expert in being afraid. This observation landed like a physical blow. Mahanama realized it was true. He'd spent years perfecting his fear, giving it more attention than he'd given any spiritual practice. But here's what you need to understand, the Buddha continued. Your mind at death will go where you've trained it to go during life. If you've trained it to go to fear, it will go to fear. If you've trained it to go to the Dharma, it will go to the Dharma. He used a simple analogy. Imagine a tree that grows leaning heavily to the east. Its trunk bends that way. Its branches reach that way. Its whole structure is oriented eastward. When that tree is cut down, which direction will it fall? To the east, Mahanama said quietly. Exactly. And your mind is like that tree. If it leans toward fear all through life, it will fall toward fear at death. But if it leans toward the Dharma, toward remembering the qualities of the awakened ones, toward ethical conduct, toward generosity, toward wisdom, it will fall that direction when death comes. Then the Buddha gave Mahanama specific practice instructions. Not vague advice to worry less, but concrete mental training. When death anxiety arises, and it will arise, that's not the problem. Don't follow it, the Buddha said. The moment you notice fear about dying, deliberately shift your attention to one of 6 things. First, remember the qualities of the Buddha, the wisdom, the compassion, the complete freedom from fear that awakening brings. Not as abstract concepts, but as living reality that exists in the world. Second, remember the qualities of the Dharma, that these teachings show the way out of suffering, that the path works, that freedom is actually possible. Not someday in the future, but as a direction you're walking right now. Third, remember the community of practitioners, all the people throughout history who've walked this path and found peace, who've faced death without terror because they understood something true about existence. Fourth, remember your own ethical conduct. Not to feel proud or superior, but to recognize that you've lived with integrity, that you haven't deliberately harmed, that your life has had decency and care in it. Fifth, remember generosity. All the times you've given freely, helped others, shared what you had without resentment or expectation of return. Let yourself feel the joy of having lived generously. Sixth, remember that divine qualities exist, that beings have developed boundless loving, kindness, boundless compassion, boundless joy, in others' happiness, boundless equanimity. These aren't fantasies. They're capacities that human minds can develop, and you've been developing them too. Mahanama listened, but his fear hadn't disappeared just from hearing these instructions. Blessed One, I understand what you're saying, but in the moment of death anxiety, when the fear is overwhelming, how do I actually do this? The Buddha's answer was blunt. You do it badly at first. You notice the fear. You try to shift attention to the Buddha's qualities, and 3 seconds later, you're back in death anxiety. That's fine. You notice again, shift again, get pulled back again. You're not trying to make fear disappear. You're training your mind to have somewhere else to go. He continued, You've spent years training your mind to spiral into death terror. That pattern is strong because you've practiced it constantly. Now you're learning a different pattern. When death anxiety arises, shift to Dharma recollection. This will feel awkward and forced at first because it's new. But every time you do it, even imperfectly, you're weakening the old pattern and strengthening the new one. Mahanama practiced this. Not perfectly, not even well at first, but consistently. Death anxiety would grip him in the middle of the night, and instead of spiraling into, what happens when I die, he would deliberately think about the Buddha's wisdom, about the path, about his own decent conduct. Sometimes it worked for 30 seconds before fear crashed back in. Sometimes it barely worked at all. But gradually, over months and years, the balance shifted. Fear still arose, but it didn't consume him completely anymore. There was something else present too, a sense of confidence that came from remembering the Dharma, from knowing he'd lived ethically, from trusting the path. The texts say that Mahanama became what's called a stream enterer, someone who's had direct insight into the Dharma in a way that permanently shifts their trajectory. not because his fear disappeared entirely, but because he learned to meet it with something stronger. This teaching matters for anyone carrying death anxiety. The fear isn't wrong or pathological. Death is the ultimate unknown, the ultimate loss of control. Of course, it generates fear. But you have a choice about what you do when that fear arises. You can follow it into spirals of what if and what happens that creates suffering on top of the natural discomfort of confronting mortality. Or you can use fears arising as a signal to redirect attention to something that actually helps. This isn't positive thinking or denial. It's training your mind to lean in a direction that serves you better than terror does. When you lie awake at 3 a.m. convinced something is seriously wrong with your body, when every symptom seems like evidence of impending death, when the darkness makes mortality feel overwhelmingly present, that's when you practice what the Buddha taught, Mahanama. You notice death, fear is here. Then you deliberately shift attention. The Dharma shows a way through suffering. I've lived with basic decency. I've been generous when I could be. People have walked this path before me and found peace. Fear doesn't vanish because you thought those things, but you've given your mind an alternative to pure terror. And if you practice this enough times, your mind learns that death anxiety doesn't have to be the only response to mortality. The tree grows in the direction you train it. If you spend your life training your mind in fear, fear is where it will fall when crisis comes. If you train it in remembering what's trustworthy, the Dharma, ethical conduct, generosity, the possibility of freedom, that's where it will fall instead. Tonight, if death anxiety has been your companion, remember this. Mahanama was terrified of dying for years despite being an advanced practitioner. The Buddha didn't tell him not to be afraid. He taught him where to put his attention when fear arose. Over time, that training changed everything. Your fear is training you in fear. What if you trained yourself in something else instead? Not to eliminate fear, but to give your mind somewhere better to go when mortality becomes impossible to ignore. The Buddha said to Mahanama, when you've trained your mind to incline toward the Dharma, toward ethical conduct, toward confidence in the path, then even at death, your mind will lean that direction. Not because death becomes easy, but because you've practiced leaning toward wisdom so many times that it becomes automatic. This is the practice. Notice fear, redirect to Dharma recollection. Notice fear, again, redirect, again, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, until the redirection becomes as natural as the fear itself. The tree falls where it leans. Train your mind to lean toward trust, toward wisdom, toward remembering what's actually trustworthy about this path. Do it imperfectly, do it badly, but do it. That's how you walk through the valley of death's shadow without being destroyed by terror along the way. 10 stories, 10 teachings, one truth running through them all. When the scorpion stings, you can remain compassionate. When you've done terrible things, transformation is still possible. When everything is stripped away, you might see most clearly. When tools are broken, you can still do the work. When conditions are harsh, strength can grow. When you have almost nothing, you can still give. When society says you can't, practice proves you can. When you witness horror, you don't have to become it. When violence charges toward you, peace can stop it. When death terrifies you, training creates steadiness. These aren't separate teachings. They're one teaching appearing in different forms. That adversity doesn't have to destroy you. That difficulty can become the path itself. That the hardest moments contain the deepest possibilities for transformation. Life itself is the ultimate adversity we all face. Every single person listening to these words right now is walking through their own version of these stories, facing their own charging elephants, their own broken pestles, their own moments of being stripped to nothing. The Buddha's teaching was never that life would become easy. It was that you could learn to meet difficulty without being destroyed by it, to remain whole while everything around you breaks, to find peace that doesn't require perfect conditions. May you find that peace. May you discover your own strength in life's hardest moments. May you walk this path with courage, with compassion for yourself and others, with trust that transformation is always possible. Even now, especially now.